first question, I call Mr Stephen Dunn.
Question 1, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. I updated the Assembly before Christmas recess on the preparatory work for the review of the Caravans Act, and I am happy to update the member on this issue to reiterate the origins of the Act and the Department's involvement in it. The Caravans Act was introduced in the Assembly via a private member's bill, and initially the bill was to replicate protections for residential occupiers on protected sites, as in other jurisdictions. Subsequently, protections were included for caravans in the holiday sector in the form of a seasonal agreement. In taking forward the review, a cross-departmental working group was established with representatives for the Department of the Economy and Infrastructure, who are also responsible for elements of the Caravans Act. Although my department has responsibility for residential caravans and has a mandatory duty to review the provisions relating to that sector, the Act also contains revisions relating to holiday caravans, which is the policy responsibility for the Department of the Economy, with licensing of holiday sites as outlined in the Caravans Act 1963, the responsibility of the Department of Infrastructure. That's why the decision was taken to look at the Act in its entirety, and I acknowledge the concerns that have been raised by many MLAs in this chamber, but also by constituents out on the ground. To that effect, in reviewing the Act, I have launched a consultation and engagement exercise with key stakeholders, and that remains open until the 8th of March. And the review will allow all interested stakeholders to engage, and then for the cross-departmental working group to assess the findings from that.
Mr Dunn.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answer. The Minister will know that the injustice felt by some caravan owners right across Northern Ireland within some caravan parks with little to no rights, excessive pitch fee rises and threats of eviction looming over them. Will this Minister step up to the plate and ensure a fairer deal for our caravan owners?
Well, as I said before, the responsibility under the Act for me is with residential, so those where caravans are their actual home. The responsibility for those that you're talking about in terms of holiday caravans is actually with the Economy Minister. Now, I just didn't want to review because I completely understand the impact being felt by those who have holiday caravans. We've seen it in terms of when we were going through the pandemic. So I agreed in that context to review the whole Act, but indeed I need Economy and Infrastructure to work with me. They are working with me through the establishment of the working group. We are consulting at the moment, so I would encourage you that if you have anybody that has concerns, to make sure they respond to the consultation, and the closing date's the 8th of March this year.
Ms Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Minister, thank you very much for saying that you've started a consultation and that people can respond to that, of course, up until the 8th of March. Minister, are you concerned about the staggering replacement caravan costs forced on those people who have caravans that they live in by site owners, and will that be dealt with in this or the future Caravan Act?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, we have seen some of the articles in the press in terms of how some people who own caravans have been treated. And indeed, I know through the stakeholder and engagement exercises, officials from all three departments are engaging with people who have been impacted. It wasn't set within the original Act, and that's why there needs to be further amendments that will have to be brought to legislation. And I think it is important that the consultation takes its course, that all of those, and if people haven't responded yet, I would encourage them to do that to make sure we get a completely fulsome picture. As I said, the Department for the Economy Minister will have to have responsibility as to how they take forward the aspects of those who have caravans as holiday destinations, but I am hopeful that they can do that in the context of listening to those who have been impacted over the last period.
Mr Jim Allister.
I was grateful last week to have the opportunity to lead a delegation of caravan owners to meet with the Working Party and found that a very constructive exercise. But can I suggest to the Minister that the easiest and most efficient way to give security of tenure and basic rights to holiday caravan owners is to extend the protections which already exist in Part 1 of the Caravan Act to holiday caravanners as well?
Well, that's the part of the review, because at the moment I don't have that ability in terms of that extension. That would have to be done with the Economy Minister, who does have responsibility for holiday caravan owners, and I'm hopeful that this review will start to bring forward some of those concrete recommendations.
Ms Anya Murphy.
Agad Prelas Can Collier, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her update this far. Can the Minister outline the stakeholders that the cross-departmental working group intends to meet as part of their review?
Yes, well, obviously there's a variety of stakeholders, from those who have caravans, those who actually own caravan parks, those services in and around, I suppose the management of caravan parks as well, and of course a range of others such as local councils for etc. as well, and obviously members of this Assembly and elected reps beyond that. So the consultation is open to a wide range of people. There has been ongoing engagement sessions, as the previous member had alluded to, and again before the deadline closes on the 8th of March. If you haven't already responded to that consultation and you do have concerns or thoughts, I would urge anyone in this chamber and outside of it to make sure they respond to that consultation.
Mr Mark Durkan.
Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers thus far. This consultation and ongoing work is welcome. The Minister has quite rightly outlined the cross-departmental nature of this issue, and while therefore I don't expect this to fall fully at the Minister for Communities door, can the Minister envisage or accept the need for, as well as a cross-departmental approach, maybe a cross-border approach to ensure and afford protections to caravan owners from the north who have caravans in the south?
Well, I haven't heard of that come up yet in terms of the review. I mean, obviously this legislation pertains to those who have caravans here in the north. If anything does come up as part of the consultation response that refers to any issues that you may have, then I'm sure that that will be brought up and looked at. But as you said, I mean, this is a piece of work that is being taken forward by all three departments, and we will be looking collectively at the responses and how then we collectively move forward to address the Act in its entirety and how we can shape it to ensure that it meets the needs of citizens now.
Mr Alan Chambers.
This is an important project both for my department and indeed for the people of Bangor. It was actually one of the first projects I visited when I came in as Minister within the department. And indeed the Department of Infrastructure Rivers submitted an objection to the Ards and North Down Borough Council in relation to the developer's planning application. In assessing the planning application, the Council considered that the concerns raised by DFI Rivers in relation to the reservoir flood area was outweighed by the significant regeneration benefits to an area long neglected and in need of positive intervention. On that basis, the Council set aside the Rivers Agency objection. The Department of Infrastructure is currently considering the Council's granting of the planning permission in the context of the objection lodged, and has the power to call in the planning application for a full review. It's ultimately the responsibility of the DFI Minister to decide if the application should be called in, and of course my officials are continuing to engage with all stakeholders in an effort to progress the development of this transformational scheme.
Mr Chambers.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. Minister, I would like to place on record my disappointment with the apparent lack of urgency being shown by two departments in this Assembly in relation to this very important matter. This problem with Clandyboy Lake was identified over a year ago, yet it's only in recent weeks that a report has been commissioned into what remedial work would be required. And I've been informed by the Minister of Infrastructure that she has no power to compel a private owner to conduct any...
Order. I have tried to call the member to order. He's in danger of giving a speech and not asking a question. Question, please, Mr Chambers.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. What action can your department take, Minister, to push this application along?
Well, my department and indeed my officials have been engaging with key stakeholders to progress the project as quickly as possible. Ards and North Down Council are working closely with the reservoir manager to seek completion of the reservoir engineer's inspection report, and indeed my own department has provided funding to ensure this report is expedited as soon as possible and to have an impact on the broader regeneration of Bangor. So we've been working very closely in terms of trying to get the scheme progressed, but as you'll understand, another minister has a separate set of powers which I can't intervene in, and I have to wait on the outworking of that decision.
Mr. Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for her update. Can I acknowledge the work of the Department's officials over many years? Will the Minister commit to working with her colleague, the Infrastructure Minister, to get delivery on this project, which has run on for over 30 years?
Yes, well, I have indeed written to my colleague in the Department for Infrastructure as well, just to highlight the importance of the project to both my department and indeed for that wider area, and the impact that it would have on the neighbouring, I suppose, those who live within the council area. So we're just waiting on the outcome of the Minister's decision on whether or not they're going to call in the application. As I've just highlighted, we're continuing to work with the Council around any outstanding reports, and we've put resource into that to make sure that it's done as quickly as possible. But I can't overstep the boundary into another Minister's portfolio, and I have to wait the results of a call-in procedure if that's going to be enacted.
Mr. Andrew Muir.
Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her responses thus far. Over £10 million of public funds has been spent on this scheme. There's £50 million worth of economic regeneration if approval is given. Will the Minister consider requesting a meeting with the Infrastructure Minister to ensure that this project gets the green light, because Bangor has waited far too long?
Yeah, well, I have communicated with the Infrastructure Minister on the importance of this scheme. As I said, it was one of the first visits that I had done as Minister. And you could see out on the ground, I suppose, the need for regeneration and investment in that particular area and the knock-on effect that that would have for other local businesses, plus the inhabitants of that area in terms of housing as well. But I can't stray into another minister's, particularly in planning circumstances, where they have to make a decision on whether they call an application in or not. As I said, I've put resourcing into working with the Council to make sure any study that needs to be completed is done as quickly as possible, and I'll continue to lend my support and call for this to be done as quickly and as possible as it can be.
Ms. Ciara Ferguson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Minister, I welcome this development and the hard work so far with regards to the commitment to Bangor and the regeneration of our town centres, and it will obviously make a huge difference, particularly given the pandemic. Can the Minister outline the benefits of this type of regeneration project within town centres?
Yeah, well, of course, as was already stated earlier, over £10 million has been invested over the past 10 years in terms of this development. And of course, the overall development represents £50 million of investment and in terms of a massive transformation of the seafront within Bangor town as well. Of course, that would bring a hotel in terms of then overnight stays and the impact that that would have on the local economy. It would also see the construction of 137 new homes, 70,000 square feet of office space, and then also looking at a destination and cinema space, and of course indoor and outdoor activity space as well. So this would see a huge contribution to that area in terms of physically transforming it, but also socially and economically as well, and would act as a catalyst for further investment in transforming Bangor and the surrounding areas.
Mr. Peter Weir.
Question number 3.
With the Speaker's permission, I'm going to answer questions 3 and 4 together. The Sub-Regional Stadia programme provides a real opportunity to address not only the needs of soccer, but also benefit respective communities with potential societal, economic and cultural enrichment. You will be aware of the history of the programme, including the public consultation back in 2015 and early 2016, and I share the frustrations expressed by some members that the programme is yet to be implemented since its original endorsement back in 2011. However, as I've stated, with the passage of time from that period when I came into post, there was a need to refresh and re-engage with clubs and organisations on the ground. Officials had carried out a club survey and engaged in strategic discussions with key stakeholders who oversee the game, who operate facilities, and indeed support the game at all levels. Collaboration has taken place through the Advisory Working Group, who provide expert insight into facility needs for soccer at all levels, and that included the IFA, the NI Football League, Sport NI, and indeed the department themselves, also engaging with local councils who obviously provide pitches across the board for clubs at a local level as well. Some notable changes have been identified to date, including the significant increase in the participation of grassroots sports and a rapid growth in the female game. Obviously, all evidence was gathered together, and that's under consideration at the moment. And I suppose it is important to highlight that I won't be able to progress the scheme as it is at the moment, because the agreement had always been that I need to take any proposals to the Executive for approval and also to sign off the programme and the funding, and with no Executive that cannot be done.
Mr Ware.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's very disappointing that we're not hearing that. Why would you need to sign off, given the fact that money was allocated at the initial point specifically for this? It's something that's entirely within her own department. And why can this announcement not be made and funding be made available this mandate?
The proposal was always that this had to go back to the Executive for final sign-off and also for the funding to be committed, and that hadn't been done. It's not my fault people walked out of the Executive. I had aimed that this was done before the end of this mandate, and unfortunately, because some chose to walk away, decisions at the Executive can't be taken.
Mr George Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. Minister, no ifs or buts, but you have had plenty of time to release this funding, long before the horrific protocol was implemented. And Minister, you have heard it first hand from Coleraine and Limavady United football officials the absolute need for this long-awaited funding that can help to transform their grounds.
Mr Robinson, could we get to the question?
Players and the wider communities. Minister, can you give us a definite date when this funding will be released?
Well, I share, and indeed from the exercise and the questionnaires that were filled out by local clubs across the board really demonstrates a need, and obviously, as I said, a change need in terms of grassroots sports and also the involvement of women. But unfortunately, I can't give a date now because I have no Executive to sign off and to commit the final budget.
Ms Aisling Riley.
Good last one, Corla. Minister, given the reckless decision by the DUP First Minister to walk away from his responsibilities and the inability of the Executive to meet because of this, is this likely to impact on the sub-regional Stadia programme for soccer, and how?
Well, I can remain fully committed to delivering this programme within the mandate. The mandate is obviously still running at the moment, but in the absence of an Executive, this will add further delays to the programme.
Mr Chris Little.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Association football is empowering children and adults of all backgrounds at all levels across Northern Ireland and some of the most chronically underfunded facilities in our community. It is absolutely devastating to hear of this complication. It is 11 years since the process was announced, and 3 DUP ministers and 2 Sinn Féin ministers since. Will the Minister give a commitment to do all she can to endeavour to find a way to unlock this vital funding for our community in this mandate?
Well, I would try and find every way possible, but if the restriction is that I needed to bring the programme and get the remaining budget signed off, I have to bring that to the Executive. If there's a way around that, then I would certainly do that. But of course, that's also tied into the budget discussion as well, that if a budget cannot be signed off for the next financial year, that then has implications in terms of the programme. So of course I will continue to find a way. I completely recognise the role that football has at the grassroots. We've seen the IFA work with Ulster Rugby and the GAA throughout the pandemic. We've seen the impact when sport was taken away in terms of mental health and wellbeing because of the restrictions. And I also have seen it through a small capital grants programme with clubs coming forward looking at additional resources. So this would have been a brilliant programme to get out before the end of this mandate, but unfortunately with no Executive we're not able to do that.
Mr Justin McNulty.
It's very disappointing, Minister, that funding will not be made available for the sub-regional Stadia programme as a consequence of those walking away from the executive. And I'm encouraged by your commitment to try and resolve that and find a way around it. So good to hear that, Minister. Minister, in terms of the recommendations identified as part of your department's refresh and re-engagement exercise, has this been presented to the executive?
No, my intention was to present that to the executive because they need to sign off that new engagement programme and what my proposals would be for how the money would be utilised. I'm unable to do that until an executive is up and running again.
Moving on, I call Mr Morris Bradley.
For a supplementary or a question? Question 5, Minister.
So last year, just over 22,000 PIP reviews were processed. Therefore, it's important to allow a maximum period for reviews to be completed to prevent any risk of a person's existing PIP payment running out. This is essential at the end of the PIP award, can impact on other benefits currently in payment, such as carers allowance and income-related benefits. The review process only begins when the form is returned, and anyone who needs more time to complete the form, including seeking help to fill it in, will be given it if they contact the department. In addition, last April I introduced the completion of PIP award reviews in-house where sufficient evidence is available. All PIP review forms are scrutinised immediately on receipt by the department to establish if a PIP can be awarded again either at the same rate as before or at an increased rate if there have been a change without the need for an assessment. Currently, close to half of the PIP reviews are determined in-house by the department, meaning the claimants can be notified straight away of the outcome of the review, and where appropriate, awards are increased immediately. All processes are continually kept under review.
Mr Bradley.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. Thank you very much, Minister, for the answer. But, Minister, the issue is that review forms are being sent out about 10 months in advance of someone's PIP award coming to an end. The form is completed and returned, but by the time the person is assessed, their conditions have changed and the form is no longer relevant. What is the Department doing to reduce these times and make the PIP process less stressful for applicants?
Well, as I said, the reason we try to go out earlier in terms of getting the information back is just for the time of the assessment process. It is to look at any new information or evidence that are through. And I suppose the position that we want to avoid is that if you take it too close to the end of the assessment period and it's not completed in time, or there's reasons why someone couldn't turn up for an assessment, that could impact on the payment stopping, which would have a knock-on effect to other benefits that I had listed earlier. We are trying, and as I say, as nearly half of the assessments are now done in-house. I want to continue to increase that level of assessment that are being done within house as well. And we know that some of those with longer term awards, that we're trying to turn those over to ensure that there's a bigger percentage of those that are going through. And we know that 81% have been given an award of 5 years or more. In terms of those paid PIP, around 63,000. 39% of those are receiving the maximum amount payable. So we're continuing to keep this under review. Any new or additional information, I mean, it is important that the applicant gets that in as soon as possible so that that can be assessed. And if we can do that through a desktop exercise within the department, then we will be hoping to do that so that that can speed up the process as quickly as possible.
Ms Nicola Brogan.
Thanks to the Minister as well for her answers. Can the Minister provide an update on the extension of payments that protect people from the bedroom tax and other cruel Tory welfare cuts, please?
Well, obviously, in terms of the impact, I mean, we have just been passing through regulations recently in terms of extensions, so they're working their way through at the moment, with all claimants being notified as soon as possible.
Mr John Blair.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Minister if she can give any further detail around the issue on plans to bring PIP assessments in-house, including in particular if she would consider using the Royal College of Occupational Therapists model for consideration of these assessments and applications. This model considers the whole person, including the impact mental health has on the day-to-day activities of that person.
Well, I've already given a policy attempt that I want these services to be in-housed again, so I want to make sure that that's done. But to do that, I will need to work with the Department of Health. Obviously, we've been looking at the Scottish model and others in terms of the approach that they're taking, working through local health trusts. And indeed, the closer that we can align these assessments to health professionals that know the individuals, that know their injuries or their disabilities, either physically or mentally, then that would make for a better assessment, because we know that when you look at the appeals, it's new evidence that is presented at a later stage in the appeal process that overturns the original decision. So if we can front load all of that as much as possible. I did make a case to the Executive in terms of additional funding to do that. Unfortunately, it never made it onto the table of the Executive to be discussed at that point. And I've already been communicating with the Health Minister and indeed the Health Department to see how they can work with us and to look at a date for when we could start to bring these services in-house, or at least to start to pilot that approach of doing it around each of the health trusts. So those discussions are ongoing at the moment, and once I have more definitive information or dates, I can provide that to the House.
Mr. Mark Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answers. The PIP process is one that causes people a lot of stress, and its faults were laid bare by the Ombudsman's report. The Minister there spoke to her work with the Minister of Health, and it's right we should look at any and every way to take the stress out of this situation for people. Has there been any work, or is there any work being done with the Department of Health in terms of information sharing, given the delays and difficulties that many people are having actually accessing their own medical records for assessments?
That's part of the discussion that we've been having. I mean, from the NIPSO report, which I did welcome, we continue to work with NIPSO and the Ombudsman there in terms of the recommendations that she had laid out and in terms of making changes. And already we have started to in-house more of the assessments, and that's part of it. I have already signed off on my policy intent to bring this service back in-house again. Part of the difficulty, in my understanding, within health is there's no single database that holds all of this information, and we actually had hit this problem when we looked at food access during the pandemic and trying to get all of the information for those, for example, who would be shielding, is that they're kept on different surgeries' records who all use different systems. And I know the Department of Health is looking at an integrated system that starts to bring that all under one roof. But that's going to take a bit of time to get to that point. So that's why we're working closely with Health. We need to work with Health because they have the professionals then that can do these assessments and, importantly, know the individuals. So those conversations are ongoing at the moment.
Mr. Paul Fruit.
Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, question number 6.
Face-to-face assessments for PIP resumed on the 1st of July last year. Currently, this is only for those who are unable to take part in a telephone assessment due to their condition, for example, people with hearing or speech impairments, people who do not have a telephone, or those who experience technical difficulties with calls. The Department will continue to monitor the policy in areas as COVID-19 restrictions begin to change.
Mr. Fruit.
Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answer. She will know, the Minister will know the inadequacies of a phone conversation to assess how an ailment is affecting a person. And of course then the issue around the help and support you have with you at assessments is not the same through a phone conversation, even if it is on loudspeaker. Could I ask the Minister that she does all in her power to try and get everybody back onto face-to-face assessments, and when that will actually take place?
Well, we're keeping this under review with the changes in the restrictions, and obviously we know the difficulties in terms of getting the restrictions through. Hopefully the Health Minister may make an announcement shortly on that. We know that over that period from the 1st of July there were 13 appointments booked, of which 30 appointments booked for face-to-face assessments, of which 17 people attended, and then 9 didn't show and that could be for a variety of reasons. Anyone who requests a face-to-face, we will look at that in terms of considering it. But it is also recognising, I want to get to a point that we're offering face-to-face again, not just for a prescriptive group, but it's also looking at many people found the benefit of having telephone assessments. Some don't want to do face-to-face assessments as well. So it's making sure that we find a variety of offers that suits the needs of the person who is applying and whatever they're most comfortable with, that we can offer that to them.
10-second question, 10-second answer. Mr. Pat Sheehan.
In light of the DUP's decision to unilaterally walk away from the executive, what implication will this have on the work of the Independent Advisory Panel on Welfare Mitigations, and will it prevent introduction of further measures for hard-pressed families?
Well, the mitigations review is ongoing at the moment. The aim is that the panel will be submitting a report to me shortly. And that panel then, I was to bring recommendations on the outworkings of that panel to the executive. Obviously, with no executive in place, I'm unable to do that, which would mean that to look at any further mitigations, that can't be done until a new executive is in place that would identify and agree which mitigations, additional mitigations, would be taken forward.
That ends the period for listed questions, and we now move on to topical questions to the Minister. I call Mr. Mike Nesbitt.
Principal Deputy Speaker, grateful if the Minister would update the House on the status of the anti-poverty strategy.
Yes, well, there's been good work ongoing with the anti-poverty strategy and indeed with all the other inclusion strategies. As you'll remember, over a year ago, we had appointed an expert panel who had published a report which is on the Department website. After that, then, we had got into co-design groups. So there are a number of organisations and individuals that are involved in the co-design group for the anti-poverty strategy, which includes looking at children's poverty. They are working at the moment. I had met with them in December, where they were putting forward their proposals and their position paper. I met with the chair of that again within recent weeks, and there was a date in for the middle of March to meet all of the ministers around the executive table to present that. And now I'm looking to see if we're able to do that without the Executive Office being in position. There was always the intent that we would bring this forward before the end of the mandate. I know there were some difficulties because co-design just needed a bit more time in terms of looking through the issues. But with no executive then, it's going to be into a new mandate or whatever an executive can be up and running for all of the inclusion strategies to go forward.
Mr. Nesbitt.
I note New Decade, New Approach describes the anti-poverty strategy as an executive one, and therefore you need sign-off. What is the impact without sign-off on the 17% of the population living in relative income poverty, not least 100,000 children?
Well, any new schemes or proposals, as you say, it is an executive-wide policy, so that would need the approval of the executive. Also, any additional budget. And we know the circumstances. The Finance Minister is seeking legal advice to see if the budget can be progressed. But if that's not the case, then we can't look at a new budget with new and additional programmes of working into next year. So any of the proposals that are coming forward within the anti-poverty strategy, first, they can't be signed off as policy, and secondly, we can't secure the budget or agree the budget in order to progress them. So it's put on hold in some ways until an executive is up and running. I will do what I can to mitigate in the interim, but some things just aren't possible without the executive.
Mr. John Blair.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Can I say to the Minister that with deep concern we heard that the taproom licences for local producers have been delayed due to procedural issues. Can the Minister confirm why this consequential impact was not considered at the time of legislation preparation and drafting, and what actions are being taken by the Department to deliver those taproom licences as voted for by this House?
Yes, well, as you'll know, when we were going through those different amendments, I had raised concerns about the amendment that was placed and subsequently passed, and I had said that there would be unintended consequences as a result of that. So this is in fact the outworking of the concerns that I had raised as Minister. Now, of course, the legislation is passed, the will of the Assembly has spoken. but we are trying to work through those unintended consequences and issues as quickly as possible. Once I have a date for when we can progress them fully, I will of course write to members just to update them as to when that can be done.
Mr Blair.
Deputy Speaker, thank you, and I thank the Minister for the answer. Can I ask further to that if the Minister would consider giving compensation to those traders who have suffered because of this delay, and in bringing forward those taproom licences which are vital to our rural economies in many cases, and also to tourism?
Well, I would have to look at legal advice around that. I couldn't say that now because obviously as Minister I had warned or advised against pushing it at this point. So again, I'm open to looking at legal advice to that and come back to the member.
Ms Aisling Riley.
Minister, can you set out the importance of the Assembly's decision to extend welfare mitigations?
Yes, well, I think the mitigations, it's been good that they're starting to progress through. Obviously, we had passed the regulations in terms of extending the existing mitigations, and they are starting to go through at the moment, and they have been led. We're also obviously working through the legislation. We had the consideration stage last week in terms of the bedroom tax, and I'm thankful that we did get the support of the full House after an amendment around the bedroom tax and not to have an end date within the legislation. We're going to further consideration stage, and obviously the aim is to have all of this completed before the end of this mandate. That includes closing of the loopholes in terms of the bedroom tax mitigation, which will see protection for hundreds of families that have been impacted, and indeed the bedroom tax itself, over 36,000 households who will see a benefit of this mitigation and protection continuing.
Ms Riley.
Thank you for that answer and for your clear and ongoing commitment to protecting the most vulnerable in our society. Given the uncertainty that now hangs over these institutions, would the Minister agree that the compassionate measures such as these stand in complete contrast to the actions of the DUP, which has prioritised its own election concerns over the need to protect workers, families and individuals here?
I think there's a lot of work to be done within the end of this mandate, not just within legislation, but also any new policies that will be coming forward. I mean, we already spoke around the anti-poverty, there's the LGBTQI, there's the disability strategies, and also the gender strategy as well, which are bringing forward proposals that would have a real impact on many of our citizens out there within our communities. And unfortunately, with instability and with no executive, any new policies or decisions or funding going forward can't be dealt with without that executive function.
Mr George Robinson.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. Could I ask the Minister for an update on future town revitalisation schemes in East London area?
Don't have a specific update for you, but I know obviously in terms of some of the revitalisation funding, I've worked with DERA and the Department of Infrastructure, and there was a new £23 million fund that went out in terms of revitalisation on the back of COVID, and that's going through local councils for rural areas and particularly for populations below 5,000. I know there's a lot of interest in the capital programme of that at the moment. I can get you the specific details in terms of your area, and I'll follow that up in writing to you.
Mr Robinson.
And will the Minister commit to have our officials investigate Lennon Hall Street, Limavady and my constituency with a view to implementing a much-needed revitalisation scheme to overcome the dilapidated state of the street, so that the scheme would help existing traders and attract new business to the street? And I do appreciate what you had said, Minister, about the funding.
Yeah, I'll go and have a look at that for you and then follow up in writing with a formal response.
Mr Roy Beggs.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. The development of new social homes is being restricted by planning limitations and indeed planning conditions as a result of the absence of sewage capacity throughout Northern Ireland, and in particular my own constituency in Larne, parts of Carrickfergus and Newton Abbey. What actions has she taken as an Executive Minister to ensure that such capital projects are prioritised, that social homes can be built and that vulnerable people can have a roof over their head?
I think the first thing was, I call on housing being a key outcome in the programme for government. and that would mean that as an executive there would be a key priority in terms of delivering housing really from its inception right through to the home being ready for the tenant to move into, and I would hope other parties would support that call, indeed from the wider housing family as well. As you'll know, there's obviously a consultation that was opened in terms of a housing supply strategy, which looks at the whole system approach, including infrastructure that's needed in order to build homes. I have set out a plan in terms of over 100,000 homes over the next 15 years, and of course that needs infrastructure to go with it. The Department of Infrastructure, through the budgets over the last year or so, has received an increased budget in terms of infrastructure spend, and indeed I've supported that as the Minister. I have also held meetings with the Department of Infrastructure and the Minister there, who I know has a keen interest in housing as well, and of course I will continue to work with her and the Executive, if it gets up and running again, to ensure that we prioritise housing and indeed the infrastructure that's needed.
Mr Beggs.
I thank the Minister for her answer, but the Northern Ireland Housing Executive proposes to demolish the final block of flats, multi-storey flats in Larne. Would the Minister advise why the demolition of those flats was not directly linked to a fresh planning application so that social homes could directly benefit by that reduction in sewage capacity, and those who are living in those flats would have an option to continue to live in the adjacent area?
Well, I know we've communicated previously in terms of the apartments there. I mean, the Housing Executive has a responsibility to maintain and look after stock, and some stock that has went beyond its use, or that it can't be maintained or it costs more money to actually upgrade it rather than demolition. Then there's a business case that is developed around that comes to the Department for approvals. So there are a number of these sites across the north, obviously, that we're working with the Housing Executive on at the moment, and part of that is trying to align where we can the Social Housing Development Programme. And of course then there are the bigger discussions in terms of infrastructure more broadly and what's needed to deliver housing. So we're continuing to look at all of these. If there's a more specific issue, I'll be happy to take that up with you after. But the demolition and the proposed has been through a business case. The Housing Executive have brought that assessment forward, and indeed the Department has supported them in their recommendations.
Mr John O'Dowd.
Minister, you recently announced a £10 million jobs and skills scheme to assist various sectors recover from the pandemic. Can you outline for us the practical support that scheme will deliver?
Yes, well, this scheme is on the back of the Culture, Arts and Heritage Recovery Task Force that I had established during the midst of the pandemic. There was obviously a call from all of those sectors that something needed to be done to stabilise the sectors beyond the pandemic. There has obviously been financial investment that has been put in from the Executive to those sectors where they were forced to close throughout the pandemic, and I suppose where we're focused on now is revitalising them, making sure that they're sustained over the next period. Part of this then, number one in that programme, was support for individual artists, and indeed before Christmas I had opened a scheme for individual artists where they could receive direct financial support. Number two in the recommendations was a skills fund to actually employ people within those sectors, to stabilise the sectors, to create employment opportunities as well. And I'm glad that I was able to bring forward this £10 million fund, which will provide hundreds of jobs within each of the sectors, but also including the community and voluntary sector and within sports. And this will, for the first time in a long time, see funding opportunities for organisations for 3 years, staff funding, and also funding for their organisations to support that as well. And fundamentally, it is about retaining skills in the sector, because obviously burnout, people leaving the sectors, is a big concern. We want to retain people in the sectors and provide that financial support for them to do it. So it's been widely acknowledged by the sector, and indeed meeting one of the commitments in the task force report.
Mr O'Dowd.
Thank you, Minister. And another area that you have been working with recently is in terms of the Charities Bill. Again, what practical outworkings will the Charities Bill bring to that sector?
Well, the charities, obviously, from the High Court judgment back in 2019, that would have left 6,500 charities uncertain in terms of the legal parameters in which they were working in. So part of the Charities Bill, which was passed through this Assembly last week, it had its final stage. I'm glad we'll start to retrospectively fix some of those issues and indeed, I suppose, give a peace of mind to those charities. Again, we're continuing to work with charities, and indeed, at the start of the year, we had launched a new COVID recovery fund, which sees more financial resource going back into that sector to support them in the time ahead.
Mrs Pam Cameron.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for answers to our questions so far. She has already touched upon the arts and entertainment and musical sector. I just want to ask her, given what a severe impact the pandemic has had on these particular industries, and I declare an interest as being the wife of a playwright, is she considering any further financial packages in terms of helping this sector out into the near future?
Well, I met the said playwright just before the outbreak of COVID, went to one of the plays. I think, there's been a huge amount of additional funding that has went into the sector as a result of the COVID monies that we received. We obviously had worked with them to develop the task force report, which was done by Rotha Johnson, who chaired that, and that was made up of individuals and organisations coming from those sectors. We implemented the first request that they'd asked, as I said, an individual artists fund to support those working within the sectors and those freelancers that would be associated. So payments from that will be going out shortly. In January of this year, I also, through the Arts Council, launched an additional fund to stabilise and support organisations, and that's on top of this £10 million fund. Again, working with the Arts Council and with future screens, there's now opportunities here for organisations to apply for 3 years funding and indeed to employ people within those sectors to stabilise them.
Thank you, Minister and members. That concludes questions to the Minister for Communities. If members would take their ease for a few moments, when we change at the top table, the next item will be the resumption of the Adoption and Children Bill. Members, just take their ease for a few moments. Thank you.